It's done. No turning back.
We knew the cost.
Now we take control.
Stay close. I'll protect you.
Mom, what now?
We move forward, together.
Let's go.
The first assassin died before anyone in the room realized Zara had moved. Not screamed, not ducked, not grabbed her son and ran like every survival instinct in a normal human being would have demanded. She moved, and 3 seconds later, 200 of Seoul's wealthiest, most protected, most heavily guarded elite were standing in a ballroom full of unconscious professionals, staring at a woman they had spent 6 months treating like a charity case. The irony was so sharp it could have drawn blood. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the beginning, which, like most stories involving dead women who aren't actually dead, starts somewhere entirely ordinary. It started with bookshelves, specifically the children's section of the Gangnam International School fundraiser, on a mildly irritating Saturday morning in March when a woman named Zara Okoye was reorganizing donated picture books by spine height while quietly arguing with her 4-year-old son about the fundamental principles of library science. Kofi. Her voice was low, patient. The particular patience of a woman who had once talked down a 6-person retrieval team in a Bucharest stairwell using only a fire extinguisher and her indoor voice. We do not organize books by coolness factor. Kofi considered this feedback with the gravity of someone who absolutely intended to ignore it. But Mama, he whispered back, holding up a battered copy of a dragon story with both hands like it was evidence. This one has fire. It should be first. Alphabetical order. That's boring. That's system. Kofi gave her the look, the one that said he had inherited not her tactical mind but absolutely her stubbornness, and put the dragon book in the middle of the shelf as a compromise. Zara let it go. She had learned in the years since leaving everything she used to be that some battles weren't worth the energy. A 4-year-old's shelving philosophy was not a hill worth dying on. She had already died on enough hills. Technically, she had died on paper once already. Status. Confirmed killed. Neat black type. Official seal. The government's polite way of saying we would prefer you not exist without the paperwork of actually making it happen. She'd found that almost funny at the time. Almost. She became aware of him the way she became aware of most things, not by looking, but by the change in the room's atmosphere. The slight recalibration of bodies, the way conversations subtly dropped half a register, the energy of 24 people deciding simultaneously whether to approach or pretend they hadn't noticed. Kang Min-jae had that effect on rooms. She'd known who he was before she moved to Seoul. It was the kind of name that appeared in intelligence briefs as background context. Regional organized crime, extensive political insulation, considered untouchable by 3 separate agencies. The brief had included a photograph, controlled face, cold eyes, the particular expression of a man who had been the most dangerous person in every room for so long that the mask had permanently fused with the bone. She didn't turn around. She picked up the next book, The Very Hungry Caterpillar, still a classic, alphabetically inappropriate for its current position. She moved it. "You're not going to look?" The voice came from just behind her left shoulder, closer than most people would dare stand to a stranger, and precisely far enough to suggest he was testing her reaction to proximity. A very old power move, mildly transparent. She turned, slowly, no startle, no performance. "I know what you look like," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not much, just enough. "Most people stare," he said. "Most people are hoping you'll notice them staring." She looked back at the shelf. "I'm organizing books." Kofi at this point had abandoned library science entirely and was now attempting to stack 3 picture books into a tower, an architectural endeavor that Zara clocked in her peripheral vision with the resigned awareness of a woman who knew that tower was coming down in approximately 4 seconds. 3, 2. The books fell. Kofi looked up at the tall stranger with the cold eyes and said, with complete confidence, "Hi, do you know about fire dragons?" Min-jae looked down at the child. Something very old and very quiet moved across his face, there and gone, like a reflection in disturbed water. "I know a few things," he said. And that was it. That was the whole catastrophe. Not candlelight, not grand gestures, not the orchestrated romance that Seoul's gossip infrastructure would later try to construct to make sense of the story. It was a fallen stack of picture books and a 4-year-old with a question about dragons, and a man who was used to the world flinching, sitting cross-legged on a fundraiser floor and answering very seriously about mythological fire-breathing creatures for 45 minutes. Zara watched him with the professional portion of her brain, the part that never fully went offline, the part that cataloged exits and calculated threat levels and noted that he'd subtly repositioned twice to keep both main doors in his sightline, and with the other part, the part that had reorganized picture books for 2 years and made Kofi's lunches and learned every exit in every building she entered, not because she was operational, but because old habits were the last things to die in women like her. He was careful, she thought. Not just powerful. Careful. There was a difference. He stayed for 2 hours. When he finally stood to leave, he looked at her with those controlled, calculating eyes and said, simply, "Your son has good taste in stories." Zara said nothing. He left. She went home, put Kofi to bed, and sat in the kitchen for a long time in the dark, which was a thing she did sometimes, not out of sadness exactly, but out of the habit of stillness, of checking the interior temperature, of making sure the woman she was pretending to be hadn't accidentally wandered off somewhere, while the woman she actually was busy organizing shelves. She was fine. She was always fine. Fine was the story she had chosen, and she was committed. She didn't know, sitting in that quiet kitchen, that in 8 months she would be married to the most feared man in Korea. She didn't know that Seoul's elite social circuit would receive this news the way a body receives a foreign object, with immediate, systematic rejection. She didn't know that women at formal dinners would smile at her face while conducting full forensic assessments of her outfit, and that men would look through her with the comfortable dismissal reserved for people they'd already decided didn't matter. She didn't know that all of it, every whisper, every pitying look, every condescending smile, would one day look extraordinarily foolish. What she knew, sitting in her kitchen that night, was smaller and heavier than any of that. She knew that somewhere in a classified archive she was dead. She knew that Kwame's car accident hadn't been an accident. And she knew, with the deep, cellular certainty of a woman who had spent years moving through danger like water moves through stone, that dead women didn't stay buried forever. The question was never if the past would find her. The question was whether she'd be ready when it did. She got up, washed her cup, checked the locks, front door, back door, kitchen window, the one loose latch on the bathroom frame she'd been meaning to fix and never would, because a loose latch that sounded secure was more useful than one that actually was. Then she went to bed. Tomorrow was Sunday. Kofi wanted pancakes. She needed more eggs. The most dangerous woman in Seoul had a grocery list. Life, she had learned, was mostly just that. The enormous suspended between the ordinary until the day it wasn't anymore. That day was coming. But tonight, there were pancakes to plan. Before we go further, drop a comment below. Do you think the people who mocked Zara deserved what was coming, or did they just not know any better? Be honest. And if you believe that underestimating a woman is the last mistake a smart person ever makes, hit that subscribe button. Only the ones who would have mocked her too will scroll past. Seoul's elite had a particular gift for cruelty dressed in good manners. It wasn't the loud, ugly kind of cruelty, the kind that announced itself and at least had the decency to be identifiable. No, the cruelty Zara encountered in the months following her engagement to Kang Min-jae was the expensive kind. The kind that wore Italian silk and spoke in careful tones and smiled with every muscle in the face except the ones connected to anything resembling sincerity. It was, professionally speaking, the hardest kind to defend against. You couldn't disarm a smile. Well, technically you could, but it tended to cause problems at dinner parties. The engagement announcement landed on Seoul's social scene the way a brick lands in a fish pond, sudden, loud, and immediately followed by an enormous amount of agitated movement just beneath the surface. Group chats, and there were many group chats, entire ecosystems of group chats that had subgroup chats, ignited within the hour. By morning, 3 separate society columnists had published pieces that were technically congratulatory and functionally devastating. Kang Min-jae announces surprise engagement to foreign national. Foreign national. As if Zara had materialized from a weather system rather than Lagos by way of Lisbon, by way of a quiet apartment in Mapo-gu, where she made Kofi's breakfast every morning and argued with him about vegetables. The comment sections were something else entirely. Zara read them once, cataloged the patterns, dismissal, condescension, the specific flavor of shock that people reach for when a powerful man chooses someone they've already decided doesn't count. She noted the recurring themes the way she used to note guard rotations, efficiently, without emotional expenditure. Then she closed the browser and never opened those comment sections again. Min-jae, for his part, appeared entirely unbothered, which was either genuine or the most expensive performance in Seoul, and with him, the line between the two was difficult to locate. He told her once, in the flat, direct way he spoke when he wasn't performing composure but simply had it. They'll adjust. And if they don't? He looked at her across the kitchen table. They were at his apartment, Kofi asleep in the guest room, the city glittering 40 floors below like it was showing off, and said, "Then they'll learn to pretend they have." Either works. Zara had almost smiled. Tactically efficient, she'd thought. They understood each other in that way, not softly, not immediately, but with the slow-building recognition of two people who had both spent years operating in rooms where the wrong move had permanent consequences. They didn't fall in love the way songs described it. They arrived at it the way experienced navigators arrive at a destination, carefully, by a route that accounted for obstacles, with contingency plans that were never needed, but always comforting to have. The wedding was private. Intentionally, pointedly, aggressively private. 40 guests. No press. A venue whose address was distributed 48 hours before the event and only to people who had been personally vetted, which, given Min Jae's security infrastructure, was more rigorous than most government background checks and considerably less forgiving. Kofi wore a tiny suit and spent the ceremony alternating between solemn importance and barely suppressed excitement about the cake he'd been promised. He called Min Jae a Jossie, which technically meant uncle, and which Min Jae accepted without correction and with something careful and deliberate in his expression that Zara filed away without examining too closely. Not yet. The reception was elegant, subdued. The 40 guests included Min Jae's most trusted inner circle, men who had survived enough together that formality had long since burned away, and a small handful of people Zara had quietly collected in her years of invisible living. Her neighbor, Mrs. Park, who watched Kofi on Thursday evenings and asked no questions. A Senegalese doctor she'd met at a community clinic. 2 women from Kofi's school, the ones who'd never once asked about her background with that particular angled curiosity that was really just information gathering in a friendly hat. No family. Zara had no family to invite. She had a dead file and a son and a set of skills she was no longer using, and that was the honest inventory of her life. She had made peace with that inventory. Peace was maybe too large a word. She had accepted it the way you accept weather. It was the condition. It wasn't the whole story. The reception went smoothly. Right until Min Jae's second-in-command, a sharp, compact man named Park Sung-ho, leaned over during dinner with the expression of someone delivering news he'd been sitting on all evening and said quietly, "Chairman Lim's wife didn't come." Min Jae didn't look up from his glass. "I noticed. She sent a gift. I assumed. It's a painting. Lovely. Of a landscape." Sung-ho paused with precise timing. His assistant mentioned it was painted by his wife personally. Min Jae set down his glass, looked at Sung-ho with the expression of a man converting information into implication at high speed. "She painted him a landscape," Zara said from Min Jae's other side without looking up from her own glass, "to communicate that she views the marriage as scenery, decorative, passing, not worth attending in person." Both men looked at her. She cut a piece of her fish. It's a very common passive aggression format among women who consider themselves too refined for directness, she added. "I've seen it in 4 countries. The medium changes. The message doesn't." Silence. Then Sung-ho looked at Min Jae with an expression that said clearly, "Where did you find her?" And Min Jae looked back with an expression that said clearly, "A bookshelf." And neither of them said anything out loud because 40 years of organized crime had at least taught them both to recognize when a woman in the room was the sharpest instrument present. What followed the wedding was a masterclass in social warfare conducted entirely in pleasantries. The invitations came, not warmly, but strategically. Charity galas, foundation dinners, the kind of events where attendance was a form of positioning and every table assignment was a negotiation. Zara was invited because refusing to invite Min Jae's wife was a statement, and most of these people were not yet ready to make that statement openly, so they made it quietly. Wrong table. End of the room. Seated beside the guests who were themselves being managed, the useful but not quite respected, the tolerated but not trusted. Zara sat in every one of these seats with the composure of a woman who had once eaten cold noodles alone in a surveillance safe house for 11 days and considered it a productive use of time. The women smiled at her clothes. She smiled back. The men spoke past her to Min Jae. She listened to every word, because that was the thing about being invisible, about choosing it so completely that it became your architecture. You heard everything. People edited themselves for threats. They did not edit themselves for furniture. And Zara, seated at the wrong table in the beautiful dress, was collecting information the way she used to collect intelligence. Quietly. Precisely. Without anyone in the room understanding that the woman they had dismissed was the most dangerous listener they had ever underestimated. She never sat with her back to exits. She never wore heels she couldn't run in. And every morning at 5:30, she disappeared for exactly 1 hour. When Min Jae asked, once, early, in the careful way he asked things he genuinely wanted to know, she smiled and said, "Just staying healthy." He let it go. He was a man who understood that everyone kept parts of themselves protected. He simply didn't know yet that what his wife was protecting wasn't a wound, it was a weapon. And somewhere in a classified file with a neat black seal and 4 words typed below her photograph, someone else was beginning to remember that too. The morning routines of dangerous people are rarely dramatic. No theme music, no slow-motion sequences, no meaningful stares into middle distances while the city wakes around them. Zara's 5:30 disappeared looked, from the outside, exactly like what she'd told Min-jae it was. A woman staying healthy. She ran first. 4 kilometers, same route, different pace each day, because a predictable pace on a fixed route was just a schedule handed to enemies on a silver platter, and old habits, as established, were the last things to die. Then the rooftop. The building had one, accessible through a maintenance door whose code she'd memorized 3 days after moving in, and whose camera she'd noted was on a 40-second rotation. Not that she was planning anything. She simply preferred to know. The rooftop in the early morning was the one place in Seoul that felt genuinely hers. No social performance required. No careful calibration of expression. Just the city below, still half asleep, and Zara moving through forms she'd learned a long time ago in a training facility that officially didn't exist, taught by instructors whose names she was never given. 45 minutes. Every morning. The body, she had learned, was an argument you made with the world. You either maintained it or you conceded ground. She had given up enough ground in the past 4 years. She was not giving up anymore. By 6:45, she was back in the kitchen. Eggs on, coffee running. Kofi's lunch assembled with the quiet efficiency of a woman who approached school sandwiches with the same systematic attention she'd once applied to extraction routes. Same principle, really. You identified the requirements. You eliminated variables. You executed without unnecessary drama. Kofi did not share this philosophy. Mama. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in dinosaur pajamas, hair catastrophic, one sock on and one sock's location a genuine mystery. Is today a noodle day? Wednesday. Wednesday is noodle day? Wednesday is rice day. He considered this information with the expression of a constitutional lawyer reviewing a problematic clause. I feel like it should be noodle day. I feel like you should find your other sock. He looked down at his single-socked foot as if genuinely surprised to see it. Then looked up, then looked at the eggs. Are those for me? They're for the eggs convention happening in your stomach, yes. Kofi giggled, the specific giggle that meant she'd said something that landed in whatever register 4-year-olds found hilarious, and climbed onto his chair with the focused athleticism of a small person treating furniture as a personal obstacle course. Zara set his plate down, looked at him, felt the thing she always felt in these moments, not quite describable, not quite containable, sitting somewhere between fierce and fragile. The reason she had run, the reason she had survived, the reason she'd chosen invisibility over everything else she used to be. Kofi, who had no idea about any of this, was currently constructing a face on his eggs using rice, and the artistic vision was charitable assessment, abstract. Min-jae appeared in the doorway at 7. He moved quietly for a large man, something Zara had noted in their first week of living together and privately appreciated, because men who moved quietly in their own homes were men who'd spent time thinking about what it meant to share space. He was already dressed. He was always already dressed by 7. Whatever the 5:30 equivalent was for the head of Korea's most sophisticated criminal organization, he'd apparently done it. He looked at the egg and rice face on Kofi's plate. Good morning, Kofi said seriously without looking up from his construction. Good morning, Min-jae said in the careful tone he still used with the boy. Not distant, but deliberate, like a man who understood that trust with children wasn't assumed, it was built, and he was building it one brick at a time and intended to do it correctly. He poured coffee, sat, opened his phone. Zara watched him from the periphery of her vision. The way she watched everything, the way she breathed, automatically, without drama, and thought, not for the first time, that the man Korea's underworld called the Iron Chairman had a very specific expression when he sat in a kitchen at 7 in the morning next to a child making abstract egg art. He looked almost careful, like someone holding something he hadn't expected to be given and wasn't entirely sure he deserved. She went back to her coffee. Sung-ho arrived at 7:30 with a leather folio and the expression of a man who had been awake since 4 and had opinions about it. He greeted Zara with a short bow. He'd been formal with her in the beginning, the careful formal of someone who hadn't yet determined which category she occupied, and then delivered the morning brief to Min-jae in the clipped, efficient shorthand of men who'd worked together long enough to have their own compression algorithm. Zara listened. Not obviously. She was refilling her coffee, checking Kofi's bag, doing the 12 small tasks that structured a morning with a child. But she listened the way she always listened, fully, in parallel without appearing to. Two of the items in the brief caught her attention. The first was minor on its surface. A competing organization had made a move on one of Min-jae's import routes. Standard power testing. The kind of thing that happened in cycles and resolved through the particular negotiation methods of men who didn't use lawyers. The second item was the one that sat in her chest like a coin dropped in deep water. Silent, sinking, not yet landed. A foreign intelligence contact had surfaced in Seoul. Sung-ho described him as a potential information broker. Said he'd been making inquiries about Min-jae's personal security arrangements. New face. No confirmed affiliation. Zara set her cup down. What nationality? She asked. Both men looked at her. She looked back with the polite, mild expression she'd perfected over 2 years of dinner parties. The one that said, "I'm just curious," and meant something considerably more complex. Sung-ho glanced at Min-jae. Min-jae gave a fractional nod. "Belgian passport," Sung-ho said, but the contact who flagged him said the accent was wrong. Zara nodded slowly. "Probably not Belgian then," she said and smiled pleasantly, and went to help Kofi find his other sock. She found it behind the bathroom door. She stood there for a moment, sock in hand, running the calculation she'd been running since Sung-ho said foreign intelligence contact and accent was wrong in the same sentence. Belgian passports were a particular favorite of one specific department, a department that didn't officially exist, a department whose operatives had a signature she would recognize in her sleep, in the dark, at the bottom of whatever life she'd built on top of the bones of the one she'd left. She looked at the sock, small, blue, dinosaur print. Kofi called from the kitchen. "Mama, Min-jae says I can have noodles on Friday. Is Friday soon?" And the ordinary crashed back in like a tide, warm and immediate and real. "Friday is soon," she called back. She walked back to the kitchen, handed Kofi his sock, sat down, finished her coffee, and inside the part of her mind that never, not once, not even on the quietest mornings, fully stood down, she began to prepare. Not dramatically. Not with any outward sign that anything had shifted, just the quiet, cellular recalibration of a woman who had once been called Ghost, and who had just heard, in the careful language of a morning brief, the sound of her past putting on its shoes. It was coming. She'd always known it would. The only question, the one she turned over slowly as she watched Kofi argue with Min-jae about the precise definition of soon as it related to Friday noodles, was whether it was coming for her, or whether, this time, someone had made the catastrophic miscalculation of coming for the people she loved. Because those were two very different problems, and they had two very different solutions. The gala was Chairman Lim's idea, which, in retrospect, should have been the first warning sign. Men who sent landscape paintings as wedding gifts and considered passive aggression a personality trait did not suddenly develop generosity without an agenda attached. But the invitation arrived with appropriate formality, the Kang Foundation's annual charity dinner, co-hosted this year by 3 of Seoul's most prominent business families. And declining it would have been its own kind of statement. Min-jae attended these things because power required maintenance. Like expensive machinery, you showed up, you were visible, you reminded the room, without saying a word, that the architecture of the city's underworld still had your name load-bearing somewhere in the foundation. Zara attended because she was his wife, and because the Belgian who wasn't Belgian had been quiet for 11 days, and quiet, in her experience, was not the same as gone. Quiet was just the held breath before the sentence finished. She wore midnight blue. Not because it was expected, she'd learned quickly that the wives of powerful men were expected to compete visually, an exhausting Olympics with no medal worth winning. But because midnight blue had a practical advantage she'd identified years ago. In poor lighting, it read as black. In good lighting, it deflected attention toward the face. And in the specific lighting of a formal Seoul ballroom, all warm amber and architectural shadow, it made you look like you belonged to the room rather than inside it. Invisible, even invisibility. Old habit. Kofi was with Mrs. Park for the evening. He'd been bribed with the promise of extra screen time and had negotiated, with impressive tenacity, an additional 30 minutes on top of the initial offer. Zara had agreed immediately, which meant she'd started too high and he knew it, and she'd made a private note to recalibrate her opening position next time because apparently she was now being outmaneuvered in negotiations by a 4-year-old. The car arrived at the venue at 8:45. Sung-ho was already inside with the advance team, 4 men positioned at the points Zara would have chosen herself, which she noted with the professional satisfaction of someone recognizing good work. Min-jae exited the car first. The shift in the crowd near the entrance was immediate and involuntary. The slight collective adjustment of people recalibrating their awareness around a new gravitational center. Zara stepped out. The adjustment did not repeat for her. Of course it didn't. She smiled pleasantly at nothing in particular and followed her husband inside. The ballroom was extraordinary. 300 guests arranged across 20 tables, the kind of event that cost more per plate than most people's monthly rent, and justified this by calling it philanthropy. Crystal everywhere. An orchestra positioned in the east alcove playing something European and melancholy, which felt like a choice. Flowers that had been flown in specifically from somewhere with a better climate because Seoul's March was not interested in cooperating with anyone's aesthetic vision. The greeting line took 20 minutes. Zara moved through it beside Min-jae, the practiced choreography of a couple who had learned each other's rhythms without making a project of it. She shook hands, she smiled. She said the correct things in the correct register, and she listened, and she cataloged, and she watched exits. 4 main doors, 2 service entrances visible from her current position, one more likely behind the east wall based on the building's layout. The orchestra alcove created a natural blind spot from the main security positions, something Sung-ho's team had partially compensated for by placing a man near the stage, but only partially. There was a gap, approximately 15 feet of the room's northeast quadrant that existed in the overlap of 2 sightlines and fell cleanly between both. She noted it, moved on. Chairman Lim greeted Min-jae with the elaborate warmth of a man who had spent decades perfecting the performance of feelings he didn't have. He was tall, immaculately presented, and possessed of the specific smile that lived permanently on the faces of people who had never once been told no by anyone in a position to enforce it. He looked at Zara the way people looked at furniture they were considering replacing. Mrs. Kang, a small bow. Perfectly calibrated, respectful enough to be technically correct, shallow enough to communicate exactly what he thought of the title. What a pleasure. Chairman Lim. She returned the bow at precisely the same depth. Your venue is beautiful. We do try. He smiled, turned immediately back to Min-jae. Zara turned to Lim's wife, who had materialized at his elbow, a thin, composed woman whose expression suggested she was managing a persistent low-grade headache and had been doing so for approximately 20 years. I loved the painting, Zara said warmly. The woman blinked. The wedding gift, Zara continued, with the smile of a woman who meant every word and intended every implication. Landscape art is so underappreciated, you must have real patience for it. A beat of silence. Then Lim's wife smiled back, slowly, with something in it that wasn't entirely hostile. Something that looked briefly like recognition. It takes practice, she said. Most things worth doing do, Zara agreed. They moved on. Dinner proceeded. Zara ate, listened, observed. The table conversation moved through the usual registers. Business wrapped in social language, dominance performed as courtesy, information exchanged in the currency of implication. She contributed precisely enough to remain present without becoming interesting, which was its own skill, and one she'd been practicing for 2 years with considerable success. It was during the 3rd course that she felt it, not saw, not heard, felt. The particular shift in room temperature that happened when someone who knew how to move was moving with purpose. The almost imperceptible change in crowd geometry, bodies slightly more alert, slightly more clustered, in the unconscious way civilians responded to threat without knowing they were responding to anything. She set down her fork, picked up her wine glass, used the reflection in the crystal, not perfectly clear but clear enough, the way tools in the field were never perfect but always sufficient, and found the source. Near the service entrance behind the east wall. She'd been right about the wall, a man in catering uniform, moving with the specific quality of stillness inside movement that you could not teach quickly and could not fake to someone who knew what they were looking for. She knew what she was looking for. She looked at Sung-ho across the table, who was deep in conversation with the man to his left, looked at Min-jae beside her, engaged in the controlled performance of a business discussion with 2 men who were trying to determine how much leverage they had and discovering, by his expression, that the answer was none. She looked back at the east wall. Second man. Different uniform. Same quality of movement. She looked at Kofi's empty chair at home, miles away, and thought, Mrs. Park has the emergency number. The door has 3 locks. The building security knows her face. And filed the thought and let it go because Kofi was safe and the threat was here and splitting attention was how missions failed. She counted. 2 confirmed. Likely a 3rd she hadn't located yet because they always came in 3s. Her old unit. 3 was the operational standard. 1 to create the incident, 1 to execute, 1 to manage the exit. It was almost nostalgic. Almost. The first shot came at 9:47. Zara knew this because she'd been watching the clock on the far wall, not anxiously, but with the particular attention of someone timing a controlled sequence. And when the suppressed crack split the air beneath the orchestra's third movement, she noted the time the way a surgeon notes the first incision. Clinical, precise, recorded. What happened next took approximately 3 seconds. What people remembered of those 3 seconds would be debated for considerably longer. The ballroom's transformation from elegant charity event to controlled chaos followed a pattern she recognized. The half-beat of stunned silence before the animal brain overrode the social one. Then the noise, then the movement, all of it predictable. All of it already calculated into her margins before the echo of the shot had finished traveling the room. She was already standing. She handed Kofi's, her handbag to Min Jae's left side without looking. The motion was so casual, so unhurried, that the man seated beside her would later tell investigators he'd thought she was simply passing it along the table. She stepped forward. The first assassin was coming from the northeast quadrant, the gap in Sung-ho's coverage, 15 feet of blind overlap between two sightlines. She'd noted it at 8:47 precisely, exactly 1 hour before the shot, which felt in some distant corner of her mind like tidiness. He was good. She acknowledged that honestly as she moved, not out of admiration, but out of the professional respect of someone who understood that underestimating competence got people killed. He moved cleanly, with the trajectory of a man who had practiced this approach, who knew the geometry of the room, who had almost certainly walked this floor earlier in the week wearing a different face. Almost certainly. But he hadn't accounted for her. Nobody ever did. She closed the distance in 4 steps, not running, because running announced itself, triggered peripheral vision, caused exactly the kind of crowd panic that created unpredictable variables. She walked with the swift, ground-eating economy of someone who had learned to cover space without appearing to rush, and she hit him at the precise intersection of his blind side and his committed momentum. The disarm took 1 second. She redirected his weapon hand outward, away from the crowd, away from Min Jae, into the architectural dead space between a pillar and the east wall, with the specific leverage of a technique she'd been shown in a facility in Gdansk by an instructor who smelled of coffee and had never once smiled. And she used it now with the muscle memory of someone who had practiced it 10,000 times on a rooftop at 5:45 in the morning while Sol slept below. He went down. She was already turning. The second one had anticipated the first's failure. She saw it in his adjustment, the fractional correction of a professional who'd built contingencies. And this one was faster, better, coming from the service entrance she'd identified. And he had a secondary weapon and the specific focus of someone who had been told exactly who the target was. Min Jae. Not a robbery, not a disruption. Targeted. She processed this in the half-second she had and used it. Because targeted assassins had a priority hierarchy. And if Min Jae was the primary target, then she was currently an obstacle. And obstacles got managed rather than eliminated. And managed meant contained rather than killed, which gave her a margin. She used the margin. The technique she used on the second man was less elegant. There was a reason her old unit had occasionally described her fieldwork as efficient, but unkind. She was not unkind by nature. She was unkind by necessity, which was a different thing, and the distinction mattered to her even when the recipient was entirely unconscious and past caring about the philosophical nuance. He hit the floor. A table went with him. Crystal, flowers, 3 courses of expensive food, and the crash finally broke the room's stunned paralysis into full chaos. Guests screaming, chairs overturning. Security teams colliding with each other in the elegant confusion of men who'd prepared for threats and discovered the threat had already been handled by the chairman's wife. The third one was the one she'd been tracking peripherally. The exit manager. He'd held position near the main doors, ostensibly a guest, good suit, good cover, hands loose at his sides with the careful neutrality of someone waiting for a cue. When the first 2 went down, he made a decision. She saw him make it. The slight weight shift forward, the hand moving toward his jacket. Not toward Min Jae. Toward her. Interesting. She moved to meet him, and then the room's security finally caught up with events, 2 of Sung-ho's men converging on the third assassin from flanking positions, and she stopped. Let them take him. Stepped back. Became, in a single breath, simply a woman standing in a destroyed ballroom in a midnight blue dress, with her hair still perfect and her expression returning, by degrees, to the pleasant, mild composure of someone who had perhaps just witnessed something upsetting. 300 guests stared at her. The silence was extraordinary. It had the specific quality of silence that happened when a room full of people simultaneously revised a fundamental assumption. You could almost hear the revision, the collective grinding recalibration of every dismissal, every pitying look, every whispered she must be beautiful enough to distract him, turning over in 300 minds at once. Chairman Lim, 3 tables away, was standing with his chair pushed back and his mouth open, and his entire performative architecture visibly offline. She almost felt bad for him. Almost. Sung-ho had reached Min-jae, who had not moved, not because he'd been frozen, Zara understood, but because he'd been watching. His security had formed around him in the first second, instinctive and professional. And he had let them. And through the gap between 2 of his guards, he had watched his wife dismantle 3 professional assassins with the economy of someone completing an unpleasant household task. His expression was unreadable. That was the thing about Min-jae. The architecture of his composure was genuinely extraordinary. She'd always respected it. But she could read him now, in the small spaces his control didn't quite reach, because she'd been reading rooms since she was 19, and she'd been reading him specifically for the better part of a year. And what she saw in those small spaces was not fear. Not confusion, exactly. Something more like recalibration. The same revision she'd seen in 300 faces, but quieter, more interior. The look of a man who had believed himself to be in possession of accurate information about his life and was now discovering the file had been incomplete. The 3rd assassin, on the floor now, secured by Sung-ho's men, was staring at her. The way you stared at something that contradicted a foundational belief. He said it quietly, but the room had reached the specific silence where quiet carried. That's impossible. Nobody argued with him. Then he looked at her directly, past the guards, past the wreckage of the 3rd course, across the 20 feet of devastated ballroom between them, and said the words that changed everything. They told us she disappeared. Not retired, not escaped. Disappeared. The room didn't know what that meant. Min-jae did. She saw it in the way his eyes sharpened. Not surprise, but the specific alertness of a man who'd just received a piece of information and was already building its implications into a structure. He was fast, she'd always known he was fast, and he was fast now, assembling what he'd just heard against everything he hadn't known, and arriving somewhere close to the shape of it. She turned to face him. And for the first time since their marriage, since the fundraiser, since the kitchen, since the rooftop mornings and the dinner parties and the small, deliberate architecture of the life she'd built, she felt the expression she'd been carefully maintaining slip. Not completely. Just enough. The cold came up from somewhere deep, the place she kept it, the place it lived in women like her, the place that didn't warm even in good years, and settled across her face like something returning home. She looked at Min-jae. She looked at the room. She looked at the man on the floor who had said disappeared with the specific gravity of someone reporting a fact that should have made everything else impossible. I was hoping, she said quietly, and her voice was steady in the way that bedrock was steady. Not soft, not warm, just solid, immovable, geological, that this life would never find me again. The room held its breath. Min-jae held her gaze. And Zara Okoye, who had handed in her ghost and bought a life with ordinary mornings and alphabetical bookshelves and a son who organized picture books by coolness factor, felt the distance close between the woman she'd chosen to be and the woman she actually was. Not with relief, not with dread, with the particular cold clarity of someone who had known, on every rooftop at 5:30, that staying ready and staying hidden were not the same thing. She'd stayed ready. Now she knew why. The ballroom waited. Somewhere across the city, Kofi was asleep with his dinosaur pajamas and his dragon book and his beautiful total ignorance of everything his mother was. She intended to keep it that way. Whatever happened next, and something was happening next. Something larger than 3 professional assassins at a charity gala, something with a current file and current intelligence and a reason that hadn't revealed itself yet. She intended to keep it exactly that way. Min-jae finally spoke. Low. Controlled, for her alone. Tonight, after the debrief. She nodded once and went to find her handbag. The debrief took 2 hours. Sung-ho ran it with the organized thoroughness of a man who processed chaos by converting it immediately into documentation. Timelines, positions, weapon types, entry points. The precise sequence of events reconstructed from 17 different witness accounts that agreed on almost nothing except that the chairman's wife had moved very fast and nobody had seen her coming. That last part, at least, was consistent. Zara sat at the far end of Min-jae's conference table, back to the wall, facing the door, because some habits were simply permanent features of her architecture now, and answered the questions put to her with the careful economy of someone giving exactly the information requested, and precisely nothing more. Yes, she'd identified the threat before the shot. How? She'd noticed irregular movement patterns near the service entrance. Had she received any prior warning? No. Did she recognize the attackers? No. The last answer was technically true. She didn't recognize their faces. She recognized their method, their formation, the choreography of how they'd moved and positioned and timed, the specific grammar of an operation assembled by people who had learned from the same doctrine she had, in facilities that didn't officially exist, under instructors whose names she'd never been given. That was a different kind of recognition. And it was not what Sung-ho had asked. He was watching her, though, had been watching her since the ballroom, with the particular focused attention of a man who was very good at his job and had just discovered that his threat assessment model contained a significant gap. He wasn't hostile. He was recalculating, the same process she'd seen in Min Jae's face, but more visible, less controlled, because Sung-ho's composure was professional rather than structural. He asked his questions. She answered them. At 11:15, Min Jae closed the debrief. The room emptied with practiced efficiency. Sung-ho's people gathering materials, securing the 3 detained assassins for the kind of questioning that did not involve lawyers or documentation, handling the considerable logistical aftermath of an assassination attempt at a 300-person charity gala in ways that would ensure by morning it registered publicly as a minor security incident. The machinery of power, grinding quietly. Zara had always found it almost impressive. Almost. The last person out pulled the door closed behind them. The room went quiet. Min Jae didn't speak immediately. He stood at the window, the Seoul skyline behind him, 40 floors of glittering indifferent city, with his back to her and his hands loose at his sides, and she understood from the set of his shoulders that he was doing what he always did before a significant conversation. He was making sure he was ready to hear the answer before he asked the question. She waited. She was good at waiting. The classified file we pulled from the third attacker, he said finally, without turning. It had your photograph. I assumed it would. Military uniform. International Special Operations Unit. A pause. Under your image. 4 words. Status. Confirmed killed, she said. He turned, looked at her with the full weight of his attention, which was, she had learned in a year of marriage, a considerable thing. Most people performed attention. Min Jae applied it, with the focused totality of someone who had survived decades in a world where misreading people had permanent consequences. How much of what I know about you is true? He asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine question, asked with the directness of a man who had decided that the architecture of whatever they were building required accurate foundations, and he would have them, even if the renovation was uncomfortable. She respected that. She had always respected that about him. Kofi is mine, she said. Kwame was real. The life I built here is real. She paused. The name is real. Everything you've seen in this house every morning is real. And everything before it? She was quiet for a moment, not evasively, honestly, because the question deserved the weight of a real answer rather than the efficiency of a quick one. I was recruited at 19, she said, out of Lagos, by a coalition that doesn't officially exist, into a unit with no public record. We were called in for problems that governments needed solved without fingerprints. She looked at him steadily. I was good at it. Better than good. And then I made the mistake of becoming human again, and the people I worked for considered that a liability. They tried to kill you. They tried to file me. There's a difference. She allowed a small, dry edge into her voice. Filing is more insulting. At least an assassination attempt implies you were worth the resources. Something moved in Min Jae's expression, not quite amusement, but the cousin of it, the recognition of dark humor from someone fluent in the dialect. Kwame, he said. Yes. His accident. Wasn't one, no. She held his gaze. I was never able to confirm who ordered it, but the method matched doctrine I recognized. The room absorbed that. Min Jae absorbed it. She could see him doing it, the information settling into whatever architecture he was building, finding its place, bearing its weight. You chose Seoul, he said. I chose invisible. Seoul was where invisible was possible. And the rooftop, every morning. She nodded once. You never stopped training. I never stopped existing, she said. Training is just existing with intention. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed the room and sat across from her, not at the head of the table, not at a power distance, but directly across, close enough that this was a conversation between 2 people rather than an interrogation with a power differential, and put his hands flat on the table in the open gesture she'd come to understand meant he was about to say something true. Tonight wasn't a random hit, he said. No. Someone activated a search with current intelligence. He paused. Which means someone knows who you were, who you are, and connected you to me recently enough to run this operation. Yes. That's not a coincidence. No, she agreed. It's a message. From who? She was quiet for a beat. The Belgian who wasn't Belgian, she said. That flag Sung-ho raised 11 days ago. Wrong accent. Right passport. She watched Min-jae's eyes sharpen. That was reconnaissance. Someone needed to confirm I was here, confirm my connection to you, before they activated the operation. You knew. I suspected. I didn't know what timeline we were on. You could have told me. I could have, she agreed. And said what exactly? Darling, I'm technically dead on paper, and my former handlers may or may not be using you to locate me. Please pass the eggs. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Min-jae made a sound, low, involuntary, quickly controlled, that she had never heard from him before in a year of marriage. He almost laughed, genuinely, briefly, a flash of something unguarded that vanished as quickly as it arrived, leaving only the faintest trace in the corner of his expression. She filed it carefully. This isn't over, he said when he'd recovered his composure. No, tonight was a test, or a warning, or both. She looked at her hands on the table, steady, as they always were, as they had been for years, as she had trained them to be. Whoever sent 3 men to a charity gala already knew 3 men wouldn't be enough. That's not an execution. That's an introduction. To what? To a conversation they want to have. With you. With both of us. She looked up. Because they didn't just find me, Min-jae. They found me here, married to you. Which means whatever they want, whatever this is actually about, it requires both of us as leverage points. The weight of that landed in the room and sat there. Min-jae looked at her with the steady, unreadable expression she'd spent a year learning to read. The question I asked you in the ballroom, he said. How much do you really want to know? I want to know everything. She held his gaze. That, she said quietly, is going to take more than one night. I have time. You'll need it. She paused. There are things in that file, in what I was, in what I did, that aren't easy. I run organized crime in Korea, he said, with the flat delivery of a man stating meteorological fact. I'm not asking for easy. Fair point. She looked at him, this careful, dangerous, unexpectedly patient man who had sat on a fundraiser floor and talked to her son about dragons, who had let her keep her 5:30 mornings without question, who had built trust the way he apparently built everything. Deliberately, without shortcuts, one brick at a time. There's a name, she said finally. Someone I haven't said out loud in 4 years. Someone who would have the access, the motive, and the specific cruelty to run this kind of operation. She paused. If it's who I think it is, 3 assassins were never the point. What was the point? Making sure I knew they'd found me. She looked at him steadily. And making sure you knew who you'd married. Min-jae held her gaze without flinching. I know who I married, he said. Simple, direct, absolute, no performance in it. She felt something shift, not dramatically, not with any of the vocabulary of romance or relief. Something quieter. The specific weight that lifted when a person you'd chosen to trust turned out to be worth the choosing. Get some sleep, he said, standing. Tomorrow we find the Belgian. She nodded, stood, moved toward the door. Zara, she stopped. Kofi asked me last week, Min-jae said, if I would teach him to play chess. She turned. I told him yes, he said. I want you to know that answer doesn't change. She looked at him for a long moment, then she said, his opening moves are chaos. Fair warning. Good, Min-jae said quietly. So are mine. She left. And in the elevator down, in the 30 seconds of solitude between the conference room and the rest of everything, Zara Okoye pressed her back against the elevator wall and closed her eyes and let herself feel, briefly, completely, before she filed it away. The Belgian's real name was Peter Voss. Sung-ho found this out in approximately 14 hours, which was either impressive intelligence work or a testament to what happened when the most resourceful criminal organization in Korea decided to locate a single person in a city of 10 million with genuine motivation. Probably both. Voss was staying in a serviced apartment in Yongsan-gu. Clean address, corporate booking, the kind of arrangement that said I am a businessman passing through and meant I am operational and don't intend to stay long. He'd been in Seoul for 16 days. He'd made 4 confirmed contacts, all peripheral, all consistent with someone building a picture rather than executing a plan. Reconnaissance. Exactly what she'd said. Min-jae laid the file on the kitchen table Thursday morning between the coffee and Kofi's half-finished rice, which felt like a metaphor for her entire life, but wasn't the moment to examine that. He checks out as a private contractor, Min-jae said. No current government affiliation on paper. On paper, Zara said. On paper, he agreed. Kofi, who was present in body but entirely absent in attention, focused completely on the dragon book propped against his juice cup, looked up briefly at the tone of the conversation, assessed that no one was addressing him, and returned to his dragons. Zara looked at the photograph in the file. Voss was mid-50s. Unremarkable face, the specific unremarkability of someone who had cultivated it deliberately, shaved off every distinguishing edge, until what remained was a face that slid off memory like water off glass. She knew the type. She had, at certain points in her operational life, been the type. But she knew the face. Not from the photograph. From a briefing room in Brussels 8 years ago, when she'd been 25 and operational and completely certain that the people directing her work were operating with at least approximate moral coherence. She had been, as it turned out, incorrect about that. "He's not the source," she said. Min-jae looked at her. "He's a messenger, a locator." She set the photograph down. "Someone sent him to confirm I was here and report back. He's not authorized to act independently. The hit at the gala was run by a separate team, contracted out. Voss just provided the address." She paused. "Which means the source has one more layer of insulation between them and the operation." "Cautious," Sung-ho said from the doorway. He had the particular habit of appearing in doorways at relevant moments that Zara had stopped finding surprising approximately 3 months into the marriage. "Terrified," she corrected. "Caution is professional. This is personal protective behavior. Whoever is running this is afraid of what happens if I trace it back to them directly." "They should be," Min-jae said. He said it simply, without performance. The flat declarative of a man who had spent decades ensuring that fear of consequences was a load-bearing feature of how the world related to him. Zara looked at him, then looked at Kofi. "After school," she said. She walked Kofi to school herself that morning. He chattered the entire way. Dragons, a dispute with a classmate about the correct pronunciation of a dinosaur name, a detailed and somewhat legally questionable plan to acquire a second dragon book by trading his lunch with a boy named Seo Jun, who apparently collected books with the aggressive acquisitiveness of a small bibliophile. She listened to every word, filed none of it tactically, just listened, the way she'd learned to listen to him, fully, without parallel processing, without the operational overlay running beneath everything. Just her son's voice, and the morning street, and his small hand in hers, and the ordinary miracle of a Thursday that felt, from the outside, completely unremarkable. At the school gate, he turned and hugged her with the total physical commitment of a child who hadn't yet learned that affection should be rationed. "Mama," he said into her coat. "Yes. Is everything okay?" She pulled back, looked at him, 4 years old, perceptive in the specific way of children who had grown up reading their parents' silences, who had learned early that fine sometimes had a texture different from its definition. She had not protected him from everything. She had protected him from enough. "Everything is okay," she said, and meant it, not because the situation was resolved, but because resolved was what it was going to be. And she had made that decision with the certainty of someone who had run the calculation and liked her odds. He searched her face with those serious dark eyes, then apparently found what he needed because he nodded once, with a gravity that was so entirely his father's that it stopped her breath for half a second, and turned and ran into the schoolyard without looking back. She watched him go. Then she went to find Peter Voss. She went alone. Min-jae had not suggested otherwise, which she appreciated. He had simply said Sung-ho will have 2 men in the building, and she had nodded, and they had both understood that the 2 men in the building were not there to assist her. They were there in case something went wrong with Voss after she was done with him, which was a different category of resource entirely. Voss opened his apartment door at 10:43 and looked at her with the expression of a man whose reconnaissance had included photographs, and who was therefore not surprised by her face, but whose entire operational confidence visibly contracted the moment he understood she was standing in his doorway alone and unbothered. "Ms. Okoye," he said. "You have the wrong name," she said pleasantly. "But close enough." She walked past him into the apartment. He let her in because his other option was to make a scene in a Yongsan-gu corridor, and men like Voss did not make scenes. They were paid specifically for the absence of scenes. The apartment was neat, minimal, the temporary tidiness of a person who never fully unpacked, because unpacking implied a level of commitment to location that contractors couldn't afford. She sat. He sat across from her with the careful positioning of a man who was calculating exits and had presumably identified 3. She had identified 5. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said. "I know," he said, which was interesting. "If you were, I wouldn't have opened the door." "You would have opened it anyway," she said. "You were curious. People who do this work for long enough get curious about the things they've only seen in files." She looked at him steadily. "I was curious too, about who sent you. You know I won't tell you that. I know you think you won't." She tilted her head slightly. "But you're going to, Because the person who sent you is about to become a problem of a magnitude that your contract did not price in, and you're experienced enough to recognize when a situation has changed around a fixed agreement. Voss was quiet, looked at her. You know who it is, he said. Not a question. I have a name. I want confirmation. Another silence. Then Voss looked at the table between them with the expression of a man performing a private cost-benefit analysis in real time, and she watched him arrive at the conclusion she'd already calculated he would reach, because she'd chosen this approach specifically because it was the one most likely to work on a man of his particular professional profile. He said a name, one name, 7 letters. And Zara felt the room recalibrate around her the way rooms did when a suspicion became a certainty. Not with surprise, because had known for 4 years with the cold knowledge of someone who'd looked at Kwame's accident scene and understood immediately, but with the specific, clarifying weight of confirmation. Director Harlan, her original handler, the man who had gone quiet for 11 seconds when she reported her pregnancy, the man whose words had carved her life in two, the man who had stamped confirmed killed on her file and apparently spent 4 years waiting to make it accurate. He hadn't been able to locate her until she'd married Min Jae. Until she'd become visible enough, connected enough, documented enough in the social infrastructure of Seoul's elite that a sufficiently resourced search had finally found the thread. She had, in building a real life, created a real address. The irony was not lost on her. He's retired, Voss added. Officially. But he still has access, still has people who owe him. He always did, she said. She stood. Voss looked up at her. What happens now, he asked. You leave Seoul today, she said. Not because I'm threatening you, because you're a professional and you'll recognize that your contract just became a liability, and professionals don't carry liabilities. He considered this, nodded once. She walked to the door. Okoye, he said. She stopped. He's in Seoul, Voss said quietly. Has been for 5 days. He came personally to confirm the operation. She went still. He wanted to watch, Voss said. She absorbed that. Harlan, here. 5 days, which meant he'd been in the city before the gala, had watched the operation run. Had watched it fail, had watched her. The cold that lived in the deep place rose up, not with heat, because it was never heat. It was always cold, always the still below zero clarity that replaced fear in women who had burned through fear years ago and found something more permanent underneath. She turned back to Voss. Where? She said. She called Min Jae from the street. He picked up on the first ring. Harlan, she said. Former senior director, Coalition Intelligence. My original handler. He's been running the operation personally. She paused. He's in Seoul. A beat of silence. Where are you? Min Jae said. Yongsan-gu, I'm fine. She was already walking, not toward home, not toward the address Voss had given her, but toward the center of the calculation, the place where she needed to think for 5 uninterrupted minutes before she moved. I need you to understand something. Tell me. This ends here. In Seoul, I'm not running again. Her voice was level. Not angry, not afraid. Simply certain, the way Bedrock was certain, the way she'd decided in the elevator 2 nights ago and had not undecided since. Kofi grows up in a city where this is finished, where the file is actually closed, not stamped, closed. Yes, Min